Welcome to another Ontario 360 policy video from the Ontario 360 project housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Speer. I'm a senior fellow at the Munk School and project co-director of Ontario 360. I'm joined as always by my project co-director, Drew Fagan, who's also a professor at the Munk School. And today we have one of our authors of a recent policy brief entitled All Charged Up, How Ontario Can Boost Electric Vehicle Production and Usage. Connor Fraser, the author of that policy brief, is also a student in the MGA program at the Munk School. We're honored and grateful to have him contribute, and it reflects one of our commitments at the Ontario 360 project to involve members of the University of Toronto community in general and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in particular. And Connor, thank you so much for your contribution to the series and for joining us today to talk about your paper on this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me. It's an honor.
Great to have you, Connor. So where are we at? Let's think about that broadly and more narrowly with regard to Ontario itself. You know, what percentage of cars are now EVs? What does the infrastructure look like to support those EVs in general terms in 2022? And I think, it is worth noting right off the top that in 2035, the mandate is now that all cars in Canada are going to be electric vehicles, which is a big step. We're only 13 years away from that. But let's set the table with what things look like in 2022.
So a good place to start would be to say that in the past couple of years, electric vehicle sales as a percentage of total vehicle sales in the province have averaged about 2%, less than 2%, which is significantly below the national average. And Ontario, were it to meet its 2030 emissions reduction target, would need to see about 6% of all vehicles in the province be electric vehicles, meaning that the yearly sales of new vehicles would need to average significantly higher than that for the next several years. And so we're not meeting that target, unfortunately. 2022, the Ontario government has committed to seeing 450,000 electric vehicles manufactured in the province by 2030. And in conjunction with the federal target you mentioned, this is really happening. So we are sinking our teeth deeper into this issue, and the costs of not following through are going to be very significant. And I would add that relative to other provinces, Ontario does not have many incentives at all in place to support electric vehicles. When you compare to Quebec, which has its own provincial sales mandate, they have a purchase incentive for new vehicles. Ontario doesn't have these. Other provinces, such as British Columbia, have come in with, they've devolved responsibility for electric vehicle infrastructure to municipalities, and they're really pushing for all new buildings to include charging infrastructure. Ontario, if you're building a new detached house or condominium, there's no requirement for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So we are falling behind, but it's not too late. It's not too late. And I think the current government is realizing that the industry has taken a turn on this, and the industry has taken a turn because consumers have taken a turn. They see the benefits of the technology. It's good for the environment. Electric vehicles are cheaper over the long run when you factor in lower maintenance costs, lower costs of fuel, which is very pertinent right now. So there are very large benefits to this technology that are creating the long-term goals that have been set by the federal government.
And at the same time, with regard to infrastructure in Ontario compared to other jurisdictions, I think it's fair to say you hear the term range anxiety, which is something that's going to have to be alleviated. We're not doing much better with regard to that at this stage, are we?
No, there is a great report that's published every year by Efficiency Canada called the Provincial Energy Efficiency Scorecard, and they really highlight that Ontario and all Canadian provinces, but in particular Ontario, are significantly below where they need to be with the density of public charging infrastructure. There's been some movement on this file. I think the government has said we want to build a network of 150 chargers around the province by the next couple of years, and these will be fast chargers alongside highways, but that commitment is nowhere near the level that will be needed to support people easing this anxiety. And I know some people that have electric vehicles right now. When you drive to say Kingston, for example, if you do it on an off day, like a Tuesday when people aren't going to the cottage or going to see their relatives, you'll probably be okay, able to find something at a Costco or along the side of the highway. But imagine if you're traveling on a long weekend, and this is today when the majority of people don't have electric vehicles. So imagine a couple of years from now, we have more and more EVs on the road. The risk of not finding a place to charge or having to wait in line for hours can really eat at people's desire to get on board with the technology.
That's a really good description, Connor, of the status quo, ranging from the ambitious mandates that we're seeing come out of Ottawa and increasingly the provinces, and then some of the inherent challenges to, in effect, bring expression to that mandate over time. You mentioned infrastructure, you mentioned the question of consumer subsidies. At a big picture level, Connor, can you help our viewers understand the different kind of policy issues and policy tools available to governments to, in effect, kind of operationalize these mandates? There are supply side issues, supply side considerations, and we can talk a bit about those. And then there are demand side ones. What are some examples of supply side policy levers, and what are some examples of demand side policy levers to move to, what amounts to a new world of electric vehicles?
Mhm.
So a good example of a demand side lever would be a direct purchase incentive. The federal government has a $5,000 rebate you can get for purchasing select electric vehicles. That's designed to raise the demand for the technology. Other people would also characterize the electric vehicle sales mandate as a demand incentive, saying that all vehicles sold should be a certain percentage of electric vehicles. That's also going to, give consumers benefits of seeing these vehicles at their dealerships, getting to experience them, getting them more comfortable with the technology, raising the demand. On the supply side, we're thinking more along the lines of what the provincial government has done recently to attract automakers into Ontario to make sure that their manufacturing processes can be upgraded to build electric vehicles. Also, supply side for me is also something like a legislation to make sure that all new buildings that are built with indoor parking spaces have those parking spaces equipped with the electric charging infrastructure, or that the building connection to the grid has the capacity to support that infrastructure. That is more a supply side measure as well. So both of these, a good policy mix is usually the best idea when approaching something like this. And I think there's a good case to be made in Ontario, especially on the infrastructure side for tweaking the way things are currently done.
So that's great. So you've set out the policy landscape, you've set out some of the different ways in which governments can influence progress when it comes to the production of electric vehicles in the province of Ontario and the adoption of electric vehicle use at the commercial or consumer level. One thing the policy brief does, though, is it introduces into that policy thinking a real threat to progress in the province of Ontario. What is that threat, and how should policymakers in Canada in general, in Ontario in particular, think about it?
That's a great question, Sean. And the threat is the Build Back Better plan by the Biden administration. And however well-intentioned it might be, they are offering a United States consumers a $12,000 rebate on American-built electric vehicles that are built within plants that have unionized workers, and then $500 extra if the battery of that car is manufactured 50% in the US. So they're basically giving American consumers $12,500 towards their car. Were that to go through and pass Congress, it would basically mean that no electric vehicles manufactured in Ontario would be purchased by American consumers, because all the American-built cars are $12,500 cheaper. So it would torpedo a lot of the decisions, at least the announcements that these companies have made to locate their manufacturing in Ontario. Unless, of course, we won't have a significant impact. I think that the situation that if we want to maintain the manufacturing base in Ontario, if we're serious about keeping these jobs, about getting on board with this transition that's happening, we can't leave any stone unturned, and we need a broad policy suite to really get adoption going, to show these manufacturers that we're committed not only to incentivizing their manufacturing operations, but making sure that Ontarians see the need for this product that they're building. And I would just finish by saying that I don't know whether the attitude of the Biden administration is going to change. Like they're going for this policy for a reason, because they're in a corner, and the Republican successor potentially to Joe Biden would do the exact same thing. So I think we need to also be very mindful of where they're coming from, and understand that, you know, he's very concerned about his political position as well. But how do we work together to stick together as North Americans is the question.
So you suggest various measures to sort of combat the fight back against the potential of the Build Back Better proposal, you know, including, you know, and this has been talked about broadly, potentially a case under the terms of the new NAFTA, CUSMA, incentives of our own. But fundamentally, our challenge is that so much of the auto industry on this side of the border, and has been true since the Canada-US Auto Pact of the mid-60s, you know, a large majority of the cars built in Ontario are sold in the United States. And effectively, the border is being made stickier, if you like, or wider or higher because of this initiative. Is there much that can be done beyond incentives for our own purchasers and a case under CUSMA? Is there anything other than that, and some very broad lobbying to convince Washington that the US-Canada auto industries are actually industry?
I think the lobbying case will be important, and I know there's another briefing that focuses more on the manufacturing side, which I read, and I agree that there are some points of leverage that might be very useful to bring up to to the Americans, and specifically some states that have heavy manufacturing operations that might not qualify for the proposed incentive. But other than that, I am not sure what might be done to change Biden's mind. I do think that a demand incentive might be necessary if they were to go ahead with that. I know that the current government in Ontario has been reluctant to reintroduce purchase incentives like the federal one, citing that, you know, right now the technology is purchased predominantly by Ontarians of higher net worth. So how can we justify giving these handouts when there's so many people in the province that are struggling? But were that to go through, I think a purchase incentive, a coordinated purchase incentive with across multiple provinces for made in Canada electric vehicles could really be helpful and increase the near-term demand, because over the long term, in the absence of the Biden administration's proposal, over the long term, we're going to see the federal sales mandate take in place. And maybe this is more of the the physically conservative side of me speaking, but it's the job of the car companies to, at the end of the day, show consumers that their technology is the one to get on board with. But in the short term, potentially a coordinated demand measure in response to an American incentive. Yeah.
Still a tough situation to be in.
Very
Indeed.
tough situation.
So let's wrap up with a bit of a picture of the future. As Drew said before we started, these mandates will be in effect in 13 years. A lot needs to happen between now and then to move to, what amounts to a fully electric vehicle automotive industry. So we've talked about support on the production side. We've talked about possible support on the demand side in the form of consumer subsidies. Why don't we just wrap up with a discussion, Connor, of public and private infrastructure. So there may be a need for public spending for greater public infrastructure. But you really, I think, do a great job in the policy brief talking about the role of provincial and local regulatory tools to ensure that EVs are part of urban planning and even private development. Do you want to wrap up just talking a bit about what needs to be done over the next 13 years to kind of bring the idea of electric vehicles into reality?
Perfect. Thank you. To just start off with this question, I would say that cooperation is the key, and it really all comes back to the paper that was recently done by Thomas Hatchard and Edith Slack from IMFG, also at the Monk School, about the need for the province to cooperate with municipalities and coordinate their response to the issue. And secondly, what I've been thinking about more recently is the unique infrastructure that we have in Ontario and the unique needs that Ontario has relative to other places. So when you think about Quebec, for example, they are ahead of us with respect to uptake of electric vehicles. They also have a lot of public charging infrastructure, but Quebec also, especially the Montreal area, is much higher density than Toronto. Quebec has multi-units. This is the classic 3 or 4 story buildings, multiple families. They don't exactly have a lot of private indoor parking spaces there. They're mostly parking on the streets, so hence the need for public infrastructure. The case I make in the paper is that private infrastructure is preferred by consumers when it is available, because you just come home, you plug in your garage, and you're good to go. So the approach I suggest in my paper is that the province really makes sure that all of the new single detached homes that are being built, all of the new condominiums that are being built that have indoor parking spaces ought to have each of those spaces equipped with a charging station from when they're being built. And they can do that through the building code, the Condominium Act. It's not a very complicated measure. And then the flip side of that is, how do we make sure that everyone else who doesn't have access to a public who doesn't have access to private charging, how do they charge their cars? And that is really where the cooperation with the municipalities kicks in, because as Thomas pointed out in our recent conversation, they have the best sightlines into the needs of each neighborhood, which neighborhoods, should be targeted with much higher public infrastructure. And there are other options available as well, such as the municipalities can zone that workplaces have outdoor charging stations for people that go to work, or that big box stores, for example, would have a certain percentage of charging stations in front of them. So people who don't necessarily have the option, the convenience of charging at home, can then go and charge there and have minimal disruption to their lives. And I would just end by saying that right now, the way that we're going, we're kind of missing the ball on this. And given the shortage in the number of skilled tradespeople out there, I already know that it's very expensive right now to install electric vehicle infrastructure in homes. But imagine 5 or 10 years from now, when we're estimating that the demand will be much higher, can you imagine how expensive it's going to be if you're a consumer and you want to install this equipment in your house and they say, okay, but it's going to be 5 or 6 grand on top of your car. So we don't want to lose the convenience of the private infrastructure, but I'm just concerned that down the road, there's going to be a very big imbalance between the demand for the infrastructure and the ability of, or the number of people that are qualified to install it.
Well, Connor, that sense of urgency is reflected in your policy brief entitled All Charged Up, How Ontario Can Boost Electric Vehicle Production and Usage. Viewers can find it at our website, on360.ca. Connor, thanks again for your contribution to our pre-election series at Ontario 360 and for taking the time to speak with Drew and me today.